There are 95 seats in the Grand Ring of the Continuum Assembly, and for as long as any living delegate could remember, only 94 of them had ever been filled. Seat 95 sat at the far curve of the horseshoe, where the amphitheater's tiered floor dipped lowest, closest to the light well that let in the pale glow of the dead star the station orbited. It was carved from a pale composite stone quarried from a moon that no longer had a name anyone used out loud, and it was, by every visible measure, no different from the other 94. It had armrests. It had a data terminal built into its right side. It had a small brass plate at its base, blank, waiting for a species designation that had never been engraved. If you asked a first-cycle delegate about it, they would tell you, with the particular confidence of someone repeating something they had been told rather than something they understood, that the seat was reserved. Reserved for what they usually could not say. Ask a second or third cycle delegate, and you'd get something closer to the truth, delivered quietly, usually while looking somewhere else. It's under review. It's always under review. Don't ask about it during session. The Continuum Assembly governed 81 worlds and their attendant colonies, defended 11,000 years of accumulated treaty law, and had, in that time, absorbed 94 species into its membership through processes that ranged from centuries-long courtship to, in 3 documented cases, outright annexation after catastrophic first contact. It was not an institution known for gentleness. It was an institution known for precision, for the specific, grinding, magnificent precision of a bureaucracy that had outlived every one of its founders many times over. And somewhere in the sub-basement archive of that bureaucracy, 12 kilometers beneath the Grand Ring in a records vault maintained by a species called the Elodyne, small, patient, fastidious clerks who had voluntarily taken on the administration of assembly law because no one else wanted the job and they unusually loved it, there sat a file. It had a case number, a species designation, and a status flag that read, in the dry administrative shorthand of Assembly Standard, petition lapsed, sovereignty unverified, auto-renewal denied, cycle 4. The species designation was Sol 3, human. No one on Earth knew the file existed. This was not, strictly speaking, a secret. It was simply a fact that had never made its way into any document Earth had ever been permitted to read, because Earth had never been permitted to read anything the Assembly produced. First contact 51 years prior had been brief, formal, and almost entirely one-directional. A single Elodyne survey vessel had catalogued the system, logged a provisional species designation, transmitted a data packet containing basic first contact protocol, and left. No one had come back. Humanity had spent half a century assuming this meant not yet. It had never occurred to anyone that it might mean already decided, and decided against. That was about to change because 8,000 kilometers above the asteroid field designated Belt 7 in the outer edge of Sol system, a salvage crew was about to pull a very old, very quiet piece of hardware out of the dark. Chapter 2. What the Halcyon Drift found. The Halcyon Drift was not a research vessel. It was a salvage tug, 40 years old, held together by its captain's stubbornness and a maintenance budget that existed mostly in theory. Its crew of 6 worked the Belt 7 field on contract for a mining consortium, hauling in derelict equipment, dead satellites, and the occasional piece of pre-expansion junk that had been drifting since before anyone alive had been born. Chief Engineer Dev Aconcon-Reyes was the one who flagged the anomaly. It came up on a routine debris sweep as a metallic contact with an internal power signature, faint but present, which was unusual for something that had clearly been floating dead in the dark for a very long time. "That's not one of ours," said Captain Marisol Ferreira, looking at the readout over Dev's shoulder. "That's not anyone's. Look at the hull composite." It wasn't. The object was roughly the size of a delivery van, matte black, with a surface texture that didn't match anything in the Drift's materials database. Not human, not any of the handful of alien artifacts humanity had recovered in the 51 years since first contact. It had no visible propulsion. It had, as far as anyone could tell once they hauled it into the cargo bay and ran a scan, no visible anything except a single sealed compartment and, at its core, something that was very clearly a power cell, still, improbably after what the isotope decay suggested was at least 4 centuries, putting out a trickle of charge. "Could be a weapon," said the ship's second engineer, a cautious man named Priyesh Anand who had, in fairness, said this about every unidentified object the Drift had ever hauled in, including once about a defunct communications buoy from 2091. "Could be," Dev agreed. "Could also be the most interesting thing anyone in this system has found since the Elodyne ship showed up and then left forever. I'd like to open it before we decide it's going to kill us." They opened it 2 days later, after running every non-invasive scan they had access to and finding nothing that suggested imminent detonation. Inside was a lattice of crystalline storage medium, dense and dark, wrapped around a central processing core that hummed to faint life the moment their diagnostic rig made contact with it. The rest of the crew treated the find, for the first several days, the way the Halcyon Drift treated most unexplained cargo, with a mixture of curiosity and profound indifference, since strange debris was, in the end, simply part of the job. Priyesh Anand ran his usual battery of hazard scans and pronounced it, grudgingly, "Probably not going to kill us today," which was as close to an endorsement as he ever gave anything. The ship's cook, a broad, cheerful man named Obi who had no formal role in any of what followed, but who fed the entire crew through 6 increasingly obsessive weeks of decoding work without once complaining about the extra hours everyone was keeping, later joked that he'd fed more meals to that black metal box, in the form of people hunched over it forgetting to eat, than he had to some of the actual crew members. Captain Ferreira gave Dev exactly 1 week of ship's time to determine whether the object was worth the fuel cost of hauling it back to a proper research facility, on the reasonable grounds that a 40-year-old salvage tug operating on a mining consortium's contract could not simply detour indefinitely to satisfy her chief engineer's curiosity. Dev used every hour of that week and asked, at the end of it, for one more and then another until Ferreira, who had known Dev for 11 years and had learned, in that time, exactly when her engineer's stubbornness was worth betting the schedule on, simply stopped asking and let her work. It took them 6 weeks to get even a partial read on the contents, because the encoding wasn't anything close to human standard, and because, as they'd learn much later, the device hadn't been built to be read by humans at all. It was an assembly diplomatic relay buoy, the kind used to cache and forward low-priority archival transmissions between outer survey stations and the Grand Ring, and it had, through what an Eladine archivist would later describe with visible professional horror as a routing failure of considerable historical significance, drifted for 400 years with a cache of undelivered administrative records still sitting in its memory, slowly leaking that faint trickle of power into a slow, patient, useless data preservation loop. It was, in short, an 400-year-old piece of interstellar dead mail. Dev Aconcores did not know any of this when she finally cracked enough of the compression scheme to pull readable fragments off the core. What she knew was that the fragments contained structured data, headers, timestamps, something that looked unmistakably like a case filing system, and that one recurring string of characters, once she ran it against every linguistic database humanity had assembled from the original Eladine First Contact packet, resolved into something that made her put down her tools and sit very still for almost a full minute. Sol 3. She called her captain. Her captain called the consortium's legal liaison. The legal liaison, after a full day of not believing what she was looking at, called someone she knew at the UN Office of Exoplanetary Affairs, a small, chronically underfunded department that most governments treated as a formality. And the person at the UN who picked up that call happened to be one of the only 3 humans alive who had ever managed to get a working, if partial, translation of assembly standard administrative language, because she had spent the last 9 years of her career doing almost nothing else. Her name was Dr. Arya Kessler, and she was about to become extremely inconvenient to a great many people who had never heard of her. Chapter 3. 40 days Arya Kessler had trained as a contract lawyer before she'd retrained as, essentially, the closest thing humanity had to an expert in a legal system that had never formally acknowledged Earth existed enough to be governed by it. It was an odd career, built on the scraps. The original Eladine First Contact packet, 41 minutes of formal greeting protocol and basic legal notice that the UN's linguistics team had spent a decade partially translating. 3 subsequent unmanned probes that had passed through the system on unrelated survey routes and left behind fragments of open broadcast administrative chatter. And now, apparently, 400 years of someone else's undelivered mail. She flew to the consortium's private research annex outside Nairobi within 18 hours of the call, because 18 hours was as fast as an intercontinental flight would allow, and she spent the next 11 days barely sleeping, working alongside Dev Aconcores, who had been flown in specifically because she was the only person who'd successfully touched the core without corrupting it, and a rotating team of 6 linguists who mostly stayed out of her way once it became clear she was faster at this than any of them. By day 12, she had enough of a working translation to understand what she was looking at, and by day 14, she understood it well enough to feel sick. The buoy's cache contained partial records from something the documents called, in Assembly Standards' dense administrative register, the Sol 3 registration file. It was not a single document. It was a stack of them, spanning what the timestamp suggested was roughly 200 years of a recurring bureaucratic cycle, and reading through them in order felt, Arya would later say, like reading someone's slow, patient, entirely accidental erasure. The first entry was the original survey report from First Contact, 51 years ago by Earth Reckoning, the same visit humanity already knew about. But the Assembly's internal notes on that visit said something Earth had never been told. That the surveying Eladine officer had flagged Sol 3 for provisional registration, the first formal step toward Assembly membership, and had noted, almost as an aside, that the species lacked what Assembly law called a recognized unified authority, a single governing body empowered to accept or decline the registration on the species' behalf. Under Assembly statute, provisional registration without a recognized unified authority triggered something called an automatic audit cycle. Every 50 years, the file would be reviewed, and if no unified authority had emerged to formally claim the seat, the registration would lapse and reset, silently without notification and this was the detail that made Aria's hands go cold when she finally parsed it correctly. Notification was the responsibility of the Outreach Office. And the Outreach Office, according to a terse internal memo buried 3 cycles deep in the file, had deprioritized unverified sovereignty cases indefinitely after a budget restructuring that predated every currently serving Assembly delegate. In plain terms, Earth had been offered a seat 51 years ago. No one had ever told Earth. And every 50 years since, the Assembly had quietly checked whether anyone on Earth had shown up to claim it, found that no one had because no one knew, and let the file lapse again like a subscription no one remembered signing up for and no one remembered to cancel. The file was on its 4th lapse, and buried in the final timestamp, in a compliance note appended by an Elodyne Records clerk with the kind of dry procedural horror that Aria would come to recognize as characteristic of the species, was a deadline. 3 consecutive lapses trigger mandatory seat reallocation review. Cycle 4 lapse pending. Audit window closes in remaining Assembly standard cycles converted, roughly, to 40 Earth days. Absent verified unified authority contact within window, Seat 95 will be formally retired from the Sol 3 designation and returned to the general allocation pool. Reallocation is permanent and non-appealable under Statute 12, Section 4. 40 days. After 400 years of an accident nobody had caused on purpose, humanity had 40 days to find out it had a seat waiting for it, understand what that meant and do something about it, or lose the option forever with no one ever having told them it existed in the first place. The passage that undid her, more than the deadline itself, was buried 150 years deeper in the file, in the notes attached to the second lapse cycle, a routine internal comment, appended by an Outreach Office administrator whose name the records preserved only as a case handler ID number. Reading. Species shows no indication of self-initiated contact. Recommend continued deferral pending demonstrated readiness. Aria sat with that line for a long time. Demonstrated readiness. As though readiness were something a species could show to an audience it had never been told existed. On a schedule it had never been given. Through a door it didn't know was there to knock on. As though the absence of a knock proved indifference, rather than proving only that no one had ever told you the door was real. She thought about every human generation that had lived and died across the 150 years that single comment had sat quietly in an archive no one on Earth could read. People born the year of the first lapse who had grown old and died still believing, as far as anyone had ever told them, that humanity was simply alone, or at best not yet ready, waiting on a knock that was never going to come because the people meant to deliver it had quietly stopped trying generations ago, and had never once told anyone they'd stopped. It was not cruelty. She came to understand, turning the file over again and again across those first sleepless nights. It was smaller and stranger than cruelty, the particular, banal weight of a system large enough that no single official within it had ever felt responsible for the whole of what it produced. A verdict built entirely out of individually reasonable decisions, made by individually reasonable people, compounding cycle after cycle into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like a judgment, without anyone ever having actually stood up and delivered one. Aria read that passage 7 times. Then she picked up her phone. "I need to talk to someone at the UN who can actually make a decision," she said. "And I need it to happen today, because I don't think we have time for it to happen tomorrow." It happened, in the way these things happen, on Wednesday. It did not happen fast. Chapter 4. The subcommittee to the credit of the UN Office of Exoplanetary Affairs, they convened an emergency session within 72 hours of Aria's briefing, which, for an institution that had spent 5 decades treating exoplanetary affairs as a hypothetical, was close to a sprint. To the discredit of everyone involved, the session produced, after 4 days of genuinely urgent-sounding debate, a working group tasked with assessing the feasibility and legal standing of a formal Assembly outreach initiative, with a first report due in 90 days. Aria sat through the entire session. She had been invited as a technical consultant, which in practice meant she was allowed to speak for exactly 6 minutes near the end, after 2 hours of representatives from 14 different member states debating whether the discovery constituted a matter for the Security Council, the General Assembly, a newly formed special committee, or some combination of all three, and whether any statement made to an alien governing body could be considered binding without a ratification process that, under the UN's own charter, would take a minimum of 6 weeks even in the best case. "With respect," Aria said when her 6 minutes came, "the audit window closes in 36 days, not 90. 36. I'm not asking you to ratify a treaty. I'm asking someone with standing to walk through a door that is currently open and is not going to stay that way." "And who would you suggest?" asked the representative from a permanent member state, not unkindly. "Walk through that door." We can't simply send a private citizen to represent all of Earth to an alien government. That's, Dr. Kessler, that's not how any of this works. I understand that's not how any of this is supposed to work, Arya said. I'm telling you that the people who built the system we're supposed to be working within never told us the deadline existed until we found it by accident on a piece of undelivered mail from 400 years ago. I don't think we get the luxury of doing this the way it's supposed to be done. A representative from a small coastal nation, seated near the back and rarely called on in sessions like this one, raised her hand near the very end and was, somewhat to Arya's surprise, actually recognized. If the Assembly's own audit note built in a safeguard for exactly this kind of accident, she asked, why would our own response need to move slower than theirs did? Surely the point of a safeguard is that someone is meant to use it while it's still open. Because, said the representative who had spoken before her, not unkindly but with the flat certainty of long institutional habit, the last thing this body needs is to be seen acting rashly on a matter of this magnitude. We have one chance to make a first formal impression on an alien governing body. We should not squander it by rushing. With respect, Arya said again before she could stop herself, you already squandered your first formal impression 51 years ago, when a survey ship logged our species and left without anyone here even noticing enough to ask why. I'm not asking you to rush a first impression. I'm telling you the impression's already been made. What's left is whether we show up for the second one. It did not change the vote. The room did not agree with her. The room voted by a wide margin to proceed through proper diplomatic channels, to draft a formal statement of intent, and to begin the process of identifying an appropriately credentialed delegation. A process that the working group's own timeline estimated would take no less than 7 weeks, even expedited. Arya left the session, took a taxi back to her apartment, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. She thought about her nephew, Theo, 17 years old, who had spent the last 2 weeks messaging her at 2 in the morning with questions about xenolinguistics that no 17-year-old should have had the vocabulary to ask, because he'd apparently read every public report on the discovery 3 times over and started teaching himself assembly standard phonetics from a leaked partial glossary. She thought about the 7 weeks the working group needed, set against the 36 days the assembly had given them without meaning to give them anything at all. She thought about a phrase from the buoy's final compliance note that she hadn't been able to stop thinking about since she first translated it. Reallocation is permanent and non-appealable. Then she picked up her phone and looked up outbound freight schedules for the Halcyon Drift, which, she happened to know because she'd spent 11 days working alongside its chief engineer, was contracted for a supply run that would take it within docking range of the only structure humanity had ever confirmed was assembly adjacent. An automated relay way station at the edge of surveyed space, for days' flight from Belt 7, that assembly probes used as a checkpoint before entering or leaving. Human-adjacent territory. It was not the Grand Ring. It was not even close. But it was a door, and doors, Arya had come to believe over 9 years of trying to read a language built by people who had never expected anyone on Earth to read it, did not stay open forever. She called Dev Alconcorreyes. I need a favor, she said. And I need you to not tell your captain the whole truth about why I'm asking. Chapter 5. The waystation. The relay waystation had no name, because it had never occurred to the assembly that it would need one that humans might use. It was small by assembly standards, barely larger than an orbital station, unmanned except for a rotating skeleton crew of 3 Elodyne technicians who maintained its automated relay functions and processed the extremely rare instance of a vessel actually requesting to dock. Arya had never requested anything so rare in her life. She'd told her sister she was going to a conference. She'd told Theo, who she suspected didn't entirely believe her, that she'd call when she landed. She had not told the UN Working Group anything at all because the UN Working Group did not, in her professional legal opinion, have any actual authority to stop her, and because she had run the calculation on how long it would take them to convene an emergency session to try, and the number had come out comfortably larger than 32 days. She flew out on the Halcyon Drift's supply run with Dev's captain's grudging, unofficial, extremely off-the-books permission, secured after Dev spent 40 minutes making an argument that boiled down to we found the thing. We sort of owe it to the universe to see what happens next, which was not strictly an argument grounded in maritime or space maritime law but which worked anyway. She spent the 4-day transit doing what she had spent 9 years learning to do, preparing to speak a language built by people who had never planned to let her. She arrived at the way station with 1 bag, a stack of physical printouts because she had learned, from the fragments of assembly cultural notation embedded in the buoy's cache, that written documents carried a specific procedural weight that verbal statements did not, and a formal petition, drafted, redrafted, and drafted again over 4 sleepless nights, citing the exact statute number from the buoy's own compliance note. If the assembly's own internal record said the audit window was open, then Arya intended to walk through it holding the assembly's own paperwork as proof of the door's existence. The docking clearance took 6 hours to process, most of which consisted of an Elodyne relay technician named Vethric Somadair staring at Aria's transmitted identification through what she'd later learn was a species, standard expression of profound administrative confusion. "You are Soul 3, Vethric said, finally. Over the calm Elodyne voices carried a clipped, precise cadence even through translation. "Soul 3 has no recognized unified authority. Soul 3 has no docking clearance protocol on file." "I know," Aria said. "I have a petition. I'd like to file it under the audit statute your own archive cited. Case number attached. I have the documentation." A long pause. "You have read the case file?" "I have. I found it on a derelict buoy. I believe it was meant to reach us 400 years ago and never did. I don't think that's my fault, and I don't think it should cost us the seat." Another pause, longer this time. When Vethric spoke again, something in the clipped cadence had shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of careful attention that hadn't been there before. "Docking clearance granted," Vethric said. "Pending review. I am required to inform you that unregistered vessels are not authorized extended stay. I am also required to inform you that I have never, in 41 years of service, processed a petition of this kind, and I do not know what happens next." "Neither do I," Aria said, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she meant it as something closer to hope than fear. Chapter 6. 29 days the way station had no chamber for hearings, no council, no authority beyond its 3-person maintenance crew, and the automated systems that routed traffic and archived transmissions. What it had, Aria learned within her first hour aboard, was a direct relay line to the Grand Ring, a fast, high-priority channel normally reserved for emergency administrative traffic, and Vethric Somadair, who spent the better part of a full station day reviewing Aria's petition, cross-referencing it against the archive statute, and, in a decision that would later be described by an Elodyne records supervisor as outside normal procedure but not, strictly, prohibited by it, forwarded the entire packet directly to the Grand Ring's records office with a formal flag requesting expedited review. "Why?" Aria asked, when Vethric told her what they'd done. Vethric's translated voice carried a pause that Aria was beginning to recognize as something like careful consideration. "Because the statute is real," Vethric said. "Because the lapse was not your fault. Because I have spent 41 years processing cases correctly, and I find I do not wish to process this one incorrectly simply because it is unusual." A pause. "That is not an endorsement, Dr. Kessler. I do not have the authority to endorse anything. It is a forwarding." The response came back in 11 hours, which Aria would later learn was, for the Grand Ring's records office, something close to a sprint. It was not a yes. It was, in the dry precision of assembly standard administrative language, an acknowledgement. The petition had been received, the statute citation had been verified as accurate, and the case had been escalated to a provisional review panel, 3 sitting assembly delegates, convened specifically to determine whether the audit window could be formally extended pending a full hearing, or whether the lapse would proceed on schedule. The review panel would convene in 6 days. Aria would be permitted to attend, by relay, and to submit a statement. She used every one of those 6 days. She rebuilt her petition from the ground up, this time not as a plea but as an argument, structured the way she'd have structured a contract dispute back when contract disputes were the strangest thing she ever expected to argue. Cite the statute, establish the breach, propose the remedy. The statute was clear that notification was the outreach office's responsibility. The breach was equally clear. No notification had ever been sent, across 4 separate 50-year cycles, due to what the buoy's own internal memo called a deprioritization decision that predated every currently serving delegate. And the remedy she proposed was not full membership. She was under no illusion that would be granted to a species with no verified government, no track record, and, as far as most of the assembly was concerned, no real standing to ask for anything at all. What she proposed instead was simple. A formal extension of the audit window, sufficient time for Earth to establish something the Assembly's own statute would recognize, and a good faith commitment that the seat would remain unallocated in the interim. She was not naive enough to think this would go smoothly. She was naive enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough, to believe it was worth trying anyway. The panel convened on the 6th day. Aria sat in the way station's small comm room, Vethric beside her at the terminal, and watched 3 unfamiliar faces resolve on the relay screen. A sorrel elder, ancient and still in the way Aria had read about but never seen, whose species aged into a kind of glacial patience that made every gesture look deliberate even when it wasn't. A broad-shouldered Nixtar enforcement delegate with dark-plated skin and an expression Aria genuinely could not read. And a smaller, sharp-eyed Tyrannus. Representative who spoke first, fast, and without much patience for preamble. "You are aware," the Tyrannus delegate said, That this case has no precedent. Provisional registrations lapse regularly. We do not typically revisit them. I'm aware, Arya said. I'd ask the panel to consider that most lapsed registrations lapse because the species in question chose not to pursue them. Mine lapsed because my species was never told it had the option. I don't think those are the same category of case, and I don't think your own statute treats them as the same category either, which is why the audit note specifies cycles, plural, rather than immediate reallocation on first lapse. Someone, at some point, built a safeguard into this process for exactly the situation I'm in. I'm asking you to honor it. The sorrel elder had said nothing yet. When they finally spoke, it was slow, each word placed with the unhurried weight of someone who had been speaking for a very long time and had stopped needing to rush. You came here alone, the elder said. It was not quite a question. I did, Arya said. Without authority. Without a recognized unified authority behind you at all. I did, Arya said again. Because if I'd waited for my own government to agree on how to send someone, I believe I'd still be waiting when the window closed. I'm not asking you to recognize me as anyone's authority. I'm asking you to hold the door open long enough for my species to figure out who that authority should be, which we can't do if we don't know the door exists in the first place. The Nixtar delegate spoke for the first time, voice a low rumble through the translation feed. And if we grant this extension, and your species produces no unified authority within it, what then? Then the seat lapses honestly, Arya said. Not by accident. Not because a memo got buried 3 cycles deep in an outreach office nobody's checked in 2 centuries. If we fail having actually tried. That's all I'm asking for. The chance to actually try. The panel deliberated for 40 minutes. Off relay. When they returned, it was the Tyrannus delegate who delivered the finding, brisk and without embellishment. The audit window is extended, she said, by 90 Assembly Standard Days, effective immediately, pending a full hearing before a 7-member council panel at the Grand Ring. Dr. Kessler, you will be expected to appear in person. Transit will not be provided. Extension is conditional and may be revoked for cause. That is the finding. The relay cut. Arya sat back in her chair, and for the first time in 6 days, let herself breathe all the way out. 90 days, Vethric said quietly, beside her. That is not nothing, Dr. Kessler. No, Arya agreed. It isn't. Chapter 7. What was actually voted on the transit from the way station to the Grand Ring took 11 days aboard a cargo vessel that Vethric, bending procedure in a way that was becoming, Arya suspected, something of a habit for the quiet Eladine technician, arranged passage on through a supply contract routing that technically classified Arya as archival material requiring escort. She spent the transit the way she'd spent every transit and every sleepless night since Dev Oconquerez had first called her. Reading. She had, by now, the full case file, not just the buoy's 400-year-old fragment, but the complete record the Grand Ring's archive had on file, transmitted to her as part of the provisional review process. And reading it in full, rather than in the partial fragments the buoy had preserved, she found the piece that had been missing. The original lapse had been a genuine accident of bureaucracy, that part was true, and the statute confirmed it. But the second lapse, 50 years after the first, had not been quite so clean. Buried in an internal memo from that cycle, unearthed by the Tyrannus delegate's own staff during the review, was a note from a records supervisor recommending the Sol 3 file be flagged for extended review rather than allowed to auto-renew. On the stated grounds that the species' rapid technological development, combined with what the supervisor's memo called unresolved internal conflict patterns, made premature registration a resource allocation risk that should be deferred rather than escalated. The supervisor in question was a Tyrannus official, long since retired, and the recommendation had never been formally voted on by anyone. It had simply been noted, filed, and allowed to quietly steer the automated process toward inaction for 2 more 50-year cycles, because, as far as Arya could tell, no one had ever been required to revisit it. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't fear of humanity's violence, or a unanimous vote against Earth taken behind closed doors. It was smaller and, in its own way, worse, one official's private judgment, never debated, never challenged, quietly calcifying into policy through sheer institutional inertia, compounding an honest mistake into something that had cost Earth 200 years without a single vote ever having been cast on the record. Arya read the memo 4 times. Then she wrote it into her brief, word for word, with the supervisor's name and case number attached, because if there was one thing 9 years of reading assembly law had taught her, it was that this particular bureaucracy took its own procedural failures far more seriously than it took most things. Chapter 8. The Grand Ring did not look like a seat of power so much as it looked like 11,000 years of seats of power, stacked and grown and welded together by 94 species who had each, in turn, added their own wing, spire, and architectural conviction to a structure that had long since stopped making sense as a single coherent shape and started making sense as something closer to a coral reef, vast, layered, and alive with the specific chaos of too many minds building on top of each other for too long. Arya saw it first through a viewport as her transport made final approach, and found she had to sit with her hand pressed flat against the cold glass for a long moment before she trusted herself to stand. The docking process took 4 hours and involved more forms than she had filled out in the previous 9 years combined. She was met, eventually, by a Nixtar enforcement officer, not the one from the panel but cut from similar cloth, 9 feet of dense plated musculature moving with the unhurried economy of something that had never once needed to rush, who introduced themselves as Karskittenvar and informed her, without particular warmth, that they had been assigned to escort her for the duration of her stay, for procedural reasons, which Arya understood immediately to mean because no one is quite sure what to do with you, and this is easier than figuring it out. The 7-member hearing, when it came 4 days later, lasted just under 3 hours. Arya made her argument in the structure she'd built and rebuilt a dozen times. The statute, the breach, the buried memo, and then, unlike the version of the argument she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times on the transit over, she stopped asking for an extension and started asking for something else. "I'm not here to ask you to erase 200 years, she said, near the end of her allotted time, looking at each of the 7 faces in turn. Faces she had spent 4 days learning to read, however imperfectly. "I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it would be honest to pretend otherwise. What I'm asking for is smaller, and I think it's fair. A provisional seat. 10 years. No vote. No formal authority. The right to sit in this chamber, listen, and learn what it actually means to be part of this assembly, while my own species works in parallel to build the unified authority your statute has been waiting 200 years for us to produce. At the end of 10 years, you'll have something no memo and no automated audit cycle can give you. An actual answer, built on actual evidence about whether we belong here. That's all I'm asking for. The chance to be evaluated on what we do, instead of what one retired official guessed we might do 200 years ago, in a memo no one ever voted on." Before the panel withdrew, the Tyrannus delegate, a sharp-eyed woman named Corvain Idresh, who Arya would come to know very well over the following decade, asked one final question, quiet enough that the translation feed had to work slightly harder to catch it. "If this council grants your request," she said, "and at the end of 10 years the answer is still no, will your species accept that finding, or will this become the first of many petitions, each one demanding we reconsider what we have already decided?" Arya thought about the question honestly, the way she had trained herself over 9 years of reading a language that had never once been built with her in mind, to answer honestly rather than persuasively, because she had come to believe the two were not always the same thing, and that this particular audience could tell the difference. "I can't promise you what my species will do in 10 years, she said. "I don't have that authority, and I'd be lying if I claimed I did. What I can tell you is what I believe. That a species which is finally given a fair hearing, and loses it fairly, is a very different thing from a species that was denied a hearing entirely and found out by accident 400 years later that it had never been given the choice. I think we can live with the first outcome. I don't think anyone could have lived with the second one indefinitely, and I don't think it's fair to ask us to." Delegate Idresh held her gaze for a moment through the relay. For seconds, Arya would count afterward, though she hadn't been counting at the time, and then looked away without comment, which Arya would later learn was, from a Tyrannus official trained in formal register, a more significant response than any words could have been. The panel's deliberation took 6 hours. Arya spent it in the same small waiting room Karskittenvar escorted her to, drinking water that tasted faintly and persistently of copper, and eating small flavorless crackers that she would later, much later, once this was all somehow impossibly behind her, come to think of fondly in the specific way people grow fond of the strange small details that accompanied the biggest moments of their lives. The finding, when it came, was 4 in favor, 3 against. Provisional status granted. 10-year term. Observer only. No vote. Seat 95 would not remain empty. Not for now. Chapter 9, Home, and what came after the message Arya sent back to Earth was 3 paragraphs long. She addressed it to no one and everyone because she had, by this point, entirely given up on the idea that any single government was going to move fast enough to matter, and sent it through every open channel the Waystation's relay could reach. It reached Earth in just under a day. By the end of the second day, it was the only thing anyone anywhere was talking about. Theo, 17 and vindicated in every argument he'd had with his classmates over the previous month, printed out Arya's brief in full and read the section about the buried memo out loud to his entire Xenolinguistics club twice, because the first time everyone had made him stop so they could process it properly. The UN working group, whose 90-day feasibility report had by now become almost comically irrelevant, hastily reconvened to draft an actual outreach framework, and, to their credit, moved considerably faster once the stakes had stopped being hypothetical. A coalition of scientists, diplomats, teachers, and, in one case, a marine biologist from Lagos who simply refused to be left out, began the slow, unglamorous, genuinely difficult work of building something that might, in 10 years, resemble a recognized unified authority. Not a single global government, which no one seriously believed was achievable on that timeline, but a formal joint council, ratified by enough of Earth's nations to carry real weight, empowered specifically to speak for humanity in matters concerning the assembly. It was messy. It was slow. It involved more subcommittees than Arya had patience for, and at least one shouting match, broadcast live, between two delegates who disagreed fundamentally about whether humanity should be trying to prove it belonged in the assembly or trying to prove it didn't need the assembly's approval at all. Arya watched most of it from the Grand Ring, where she remained, technically still a private citizen with no formal authority, functioning in practice as something between an ambassador and a translator and an increasingly exhausted single point of failure for an entire species' first real diplomatic relationship. Earth's reaction in those first weeks was not unified, which surprised absolutely no one who had spent any time paying attention to Earth. In Chennai and Lagos and Manila and Sao Paulo, people gathered in public squares late into the night to watch relay footage of the Provisional Review Panel's finding, cheering in a way that had less to do with the modest terms of the extension itself and more to do with the simple, dizzying fact that someone from Earth had walked through a door no one had ever admitted existed, and the door had opened. In other places, the reaction was quieter and stranger and harder to look at directly. Op-eds asking, not unreasonably, why a private citizen with no elected mandate had been permitted to make an irreversible decision on behalf of 8 billion people. Furious call-in segments arguing that a 10-year observer term with no vote was an insult dressed up as an achievement. A noticeable, uncomfortable minority who read the buried memo about unresolved internal conflict patterns and admitted, in the specific hushed tone of people saying something they weren't proud of, that they weren't entirely sure the assembly had been wrong to worry. Arya read all of it. She had promised herself, from the very first night in the Halcyon Drift's borrowed research annex, that she would not let herself stop reading the criticism just because it was easier not to, and she kept that promise even when it cost her sleep she badly needed. Some of the criticism she absorbed and answered, in interviews and formal statements alike, as honestly as she'd have answered a Tyrannus cross-examination. Some of it she simply let stand unanswered because she had learned, somewhere in the 11 days of that first UN session, that not every question deserved to be resolved by the person who happened to be holding the microphone, and that a species figuring out how to disagree with itself in public loudly and imperfectly was not a failure of the moment but very possibly the most honestly human thing that had happened in it. What surprised her most, in the end, was not the anger or the celebration, but the sheer volume of ordinary people who simply wanted to help build something. Within the first month, an unaffiliated coalition of teachers had assembled a free, publicly available curriculum translating everything the Joint Council had released about assembly protocol into a form a secondary school classroom could actually use, distributed for free in 11 languages before any government body had gotten around to funding an official version. A retired postal worker in Krakow began, entirely without prompting, cataloging every publicly available fragment of assembly standard vocabulary into a searchable database that within 6 months had more contributors and more accurate entries than the UN's own funded linguistics project, run, as far as Arya could ever determine, by several hundred volunteers who had never met each other in person and organized themselves entirely through a shared spreadsheet. It was not clean and it was not efficient, and it was, Arya thought, watching it happen in real time from 90 trillion kilometers away, unmistakably the sound of a species deciding, messily and all at once, that it wanted to be ready. She was not alone for long. Within the first year, a rotating handful of observers began arriving, some through official channels once the Joint Council was formally seated, and a few in the early months before that infrastructure existed, the way Arya herself had arrived. Quietly on cargo transit, carrying whatever paperwork they could assemble and a great deal of nerve. There was a retired judge from Buenos Aires who spent 4 months cross-referencing assembly precedent with an intensity that impressed even the Eladine archivists. There was a documentary filmmaker who kept a promise, made personally to Arya, never to film anything without explicit permission, and kept it for 11 straight years. There was, on the 3rd year, a formal request from the Tyrannus government itself, the same species whose retired official had quietly buried Earth's file 2 centuries earlier, for a private audience, conducted with what Arya could only describe as genuine institutional discomfort, in which the current Tyrannus delegation formally entered the buried memo into the permanent record as an acknowledged administrative failure. Not, the delegate said carefully, an apology which is not within my authority to offer on behalf of an official long retired, but an acknowledgement which is. Arya accepted it as exactly what it was. It was not everything. It was something true, entered permanently into a record that had, for 200 years, contained nothing true about why the seat had stayed empty at all. Chapter 10. The girl who mailed herself the stowaway arrived in the second year, on a supply freighter running the same general route the Halcyon Drift had once taken, and Arya heard about it the way she heard about most emergencies by then. A priority flag from Karskittenvar's office, forwarded to her personal terminal with a note that read, in its entirety, "You should come to the docking bay. Now, not later." Her name was Priya Anandose, 12 years old, from a coastal town outside Chennai, with a school backpack that had a faded sticker of a cartoon rocket peeling off one corner and the specific, unblinking calm of a child who has spent a very long time preparing for a moment and is not remotely surprised to be standing in the middle of it. "You're Dr. Kessler," she said, before Arya had said anything at all. "I am," Arya said. "You appear to be 12 years old and several dozen light years from home." "Technically I'm enrolled," Priya said, with the air of someone who had rehearsed this exact sentence many times. "There's a youth cultural exchange pilot program. My cousin's a research assistant on one of the sponsor committees. I filled out the forms myself and used her login. I wasn't not enrolled. I just wasn't assigned to the group that was actually supposed to travel." "That's called stowing away, Priya." "It's called an administrative gap," Priya said, and something in the phrase, the particular deliberate borrowing of the exact register Arya had spent 2 years drilling into every public statement she'd made about the Sol 3 file, made Arya stop and actually look at the girl in front of her instead of simply seeing a problem that needed solving. "You read my brief," Arya said slowly. "I read all of it. The buoy report, the statute citations, the memo about the retired Turanus supervisor. Twice." Priya shifted her backpack on her shoulder. "I know how administrative gaps work. That's why I used one." Arya was, for one of the very few times in the last 2 years, entirely without a prepared response. They sat together in the same small waiting room Vethric had first shown Arya to, drinking the same faintly copper-tasting water, while Karskittenvar filed an incident report and, more quietly, ran a records check that confirmed Priya's account was, infuriatingly, more or less accurate. A genuine administrative gap in a genuine pilot program that a sufficiently determined 12-year-old had located and exploited with a precision that several senior members of the Joint Council's own legal team would later admit, in private, they found difficult not to admire. "Your parents," Arya said, "think you're where exactly?" "At my aunt's for study camp." Priya paused. "I left a note. I explained everything. I told them I'd be back in 9 days, which is the return window on the freighter's manifest, and that I did the math on the transit risk and it's lower than the risk of the school bus route I take every morning statistically because the freighter has redundant life support and the bus does not." "You did the math." "I did the math," Priya confirmed. Arya called the girl's parents that evening, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and included, at various points, tears, a controlled but unmistakable fury from Priya's father, and, once the immediate panic had burned down to something more manageable, a long silence during which Arya could hear, faintly, Priya's mother saying something in Tamil that Arya didn't catch but that made Priya's father exhale, slowly, and say, in English, "She has always been like this, since she could talk. We should have expected something." Priya sat cross-legged on the floor of Arya's temporary quarters through the entire call, saying nothing, watching Arya's face for information the way she'd apparently watched everything else about this whole undertaking. Carefully, and from a distance that wasn't really distance at all, just patience. When the call ended, Arya looked at her for a long moment. "You could have been barred permanently," she said. "Unauthorized entry carries real consequences here. I've spent 2 years building enough goodwill to keep the door open a crack. You could have slammed it." "I know," Priya said. "I read the penalty statutes too. Section 9, unauthorized minor entrance, discretionary sanction up to and including permanent restriction pending review." A pause. "I decided it was worth the risk." "Why?" Priya considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. "Because everyone back home is arguing about subcommittees," she said finally. "And you're here. Actually here. I wanted to see it before some vote somewhere decided I wasn't allowed to. I didn't want to just read about the door. I wanted to know what it looked like from the inside, even once, in case that's all I ever got." Arya sat with that for longer than she expected to. "Get some sleep," she said eventually. "You have a supervised tour of the public atrium tomorrow, and then you are getting on the next scheduled transit home, and you are going to write your parents a much longer letter than the one you left them, and you are going to mean every word of the apology in it." "That's not a no to the atrium." "It is very much not a no to the atrium," Arya agreed. Priya's tour lasted 4 hours, most of it spent staring, wide-eyed and uncharacteristically silent, at the towering layered architecture of a station built by 94 species over 11,000 years, and it ended with an entirely unplanned, entirely unauthorized 10-minute conversation with a young Sorrel initiate, barely into adulthood by Sorrel reckoning, which still meant several centuries old, who found the girl's blunt, unfiltered curiosity about how Sorrel memory-keeping worked so genuinely engaging that they spent the better part of an hour afterward petitioning their own superiors, unsuccessfully, for permission to correspond with her once she returned home. Priya left on schedule, 9 days after she'd arrived, having apologized to her parents in a letter Arya read a draft of and found, despite herself, moving enough that she had to stop and collect herself before finishing it. 2 years later, having spent the intervening time methodically building a genuine, sanctioned case for readmission grades recommendation letters, a formal application to the newly established youth exchange program's actual enrolled track, and a great deal of extremely patient waiting that Arya suspected cost the girl more than the original stowaway attempt ever had, Priya returned to the Grand Ring as an officially credentialed observer, 17 years old, and walked into the same atrium she toured as a wide-eyed stowaway with the calm, unhurried bearing of someone who had never once doubted she'd find her way back. She sent Arya a single message on the morning of her official arrival. It read, "Told you it was worth the risk. Also, I brought the letter. In case anyone asks." Arya kept that message longer than she kept almost anything else from those years. Chapter 11. What the atrium heard. It was Kamar Belhaj who arranged the concert in the 5th month of the provisional term, and he did it the same way Priya had once arranged her own arrival, by finding the exact administrative gap that let him do it without needing anyone's permission he wasn't entitled to ask for. Kamar was a cellist from Algiers, 31 years old, who had come to the Grand Ring as one of the first wave of officially sanctioned observers once the Joint Council's transit program finally opened, ostensibly to document assembly architecture for a cultural preservation grant. What the grant application had not mentioned, because Kamar had not, at the time of writing it, entirely admitted it to himself, was that he had spent the 11-day transit out memorizing the Grand Ring's public event booking statute, and had discovered, buried in a clause meant for visiting trade delegations wishing to host small cultural exhibitions, that the station's central atrium maintained an open booking policy for any registered transit visitor wishing to present a cultural performance of their species of origin, with no requirement that the performance be pre-approved for content, only for duration and venue safety. He booked a 2-hour slot in his second week aboard, informed no one outside his own small circle, and showed up with a cello he had carried, disassembled and meticulously padded, across 40 light-years of cargo transit rather than trust it to freight. Arya heard about it only an hour before it started from Karsk Ittenvar, who delivered the news with the particular deadpan Arya had come to recognize as Karsk finding something quietly delightful and declining, on principle, to say so directly. "Your species has booked the atrium," Karsk said, "for music. I am told this was entirely within statute." Entirely within statute turned out to be an understatement. Kamar played for the full 2 hours, alone, in the center of the atrium's wide-open floor, beneath a ceiling built by a species that had died out 9,000 years before humanity learned to smelt bronze, and the sound, low, resonant, unlike anything the station's acoustic dampening had been calibrated to handle, because it had never once been calibrated for a cello, carried farther than anyone, including Kamar, had expected it to. By the end of the first movement, a small cluster of Eladine clerks on their way between shifts had stopped to listen, arranging themselves in the careful, orderly rows Eladine tended to form even when no one had asked them to. By the end of the first hour, there were beings from 6 different species seated or standing around the atrium's edge, watching with the specific stillness of creatures encountering something they had no ready category for. A young Sorrel initiate, the same one, Arya would later realize, who had spent an unauthorized 10 minutes talking to Priya about memory keeping during her stowaway tour, sat cross-legged at the very front for the entire 2 hours, and when Karsk asked them afterward what they had made of it, the initiate had needed a long moment before answering, finally settling on a translated phrase that came through, imperfectly, as a grief that had decided, partway through, to become something else. Arya did not know if the concert changed anything the Assembly statutes would ever formally recognize. She suspected, watching the recording afterward more times than she'd admit to anyone, that it had changed something that couldn't be measured by statute at all, the specific cumulative weight of 94 species slowly, unofficially, one shared unplanned afternoon at a time, updating what they privately believed a newly arrived, still unproven species might actually be capable of, long before any council session made it official. Kamar played in that same atrium every year afterward, on the same date, for the rest of the provisional decade. By year 8, the crowd numbered in the low hundreds, and the Grand Ring's event office had, without ever formally amending the statute Kamar had originally exploited, simply begun reserving the slot for him automatically, a full year in advance, without being asked. Chapter 12. 7 years in the provisional decade was not clean, because nothing involving an entire species new to interstellar governance was ever going to be clean, and Arya had stopped expecting it to be somewhere around year 2. The worst of it came in year 4, and it started, as these things so often did, with paperwork that looked almost right. A private mining consortium calling itself Sunward Extraction, not the one Arya had once flown alongside on the Halcyon Drift, but a rival with a considerably larger legal department and a considerably smaller conscience, had spent the better part of 18 months quietly studying the exact boundaries of humanity's provisional observer status, and had found, buried in the fine print of the ratification's transit clauses, a gap that no one on the Joint Council's drafting committee had thought to close. Observer status granted humans the right to travel and trade within a defined buffer zone of assembly-adjacent space, but it did not explicitly prohibit resource extraction within that same zone, because no one had imagined a human company would attempt it before humanity had even finished proving it belonged there at all. Sunward Extraction began quiet survey operations in an unclaimed system 11 light-years past the buffer boundary, technically outside assembly jurisdiction by the letter of the old boundary markers, but close enough and visible enough that it was only ever going to be a matter of time before someone with actual authority noticed and drew the obvious damning conclusion that this was what humanity actually wanted the seat for. Someone noticed within 6 weeks. It was, of all people, Vethric Somadair, by then reassigned from the way station to a records auditing post at the Grand Ring, still doing what Vethric had always done best, which was reading things very carefully that no one else had bothered to read at all, who flagged the survey telemetry buried in a routine cross-system shipping manifest and forwarded it directly to Karskittenvar's office with a note that read, simply, "This will look very bad very quickly if it is not addressed by a human authority before it is addressed by ours." Arya had 11 hours warning before the story broke. She used every minute of it. She called the Joint Council's ethics office first, then Sunward Extraction's CEO directly, a man named Halden Voss who tried, for the first 4 minutes of the call, to characterize the operation as exploratory. A word Arya let him use exactly once before she read him verbatim the transit clause his own legal team had exploited, followed by the exact statute number under which the assembly could, and, if this went the way she expected, would classify the operation as bad faith resource theft, a category of offense that carried consequences for an entire species standing, not merely one company's. "I am not calling to negotiate," she told him. "I am calling to tell you that in 6 hours, I am making a public statement to the Joint Council, to Earth's press, and to the Assembly's own relay network, disclosing everything your company has done in full with your name attached. You can be part of that disclosure voluntarily, in which case there is a version of your company's future that still exists in 10 years. Or I can do it without you, in which case there almost certainly isn't. That's the entire negotiation." Voss chose, grudgingly, the first option, less out of principle, Arya suspected, than out of a cold and accurate read of which outcome cost him less. Sunward Extraction issued a statement admitting the operation, halted it immediately, and submitted to a Joint Council review that would, over the following 8 months, cost the company most of its off-world licensing, and its CEO his position. Arya made her own statement 6 hours later exactly as promised. Full disclosure, no euphemism, delivered simultaneously to Earth's press corps and to a closed assembly session, in which she stood in front of a very displeased Sorrel elder and explained, in the Assembly's own formal register, that the consortium had acted without any sanction whatsoever from the Joint Council, that it violated 11 separate statutes she had, by that point, memorized well enough to cite without notes, and that the Joint Council would be pursuing the matter through Earth's own legal system with full transparency to the Assembly at every stage, including, she made a point of adding, full public disclosure of the consortium's actions back on Earth, because she had learned, by then, that nothing built trust faster than a species willing to embarrass itself in public rather than hide its own mistakes. The Sorrel elder listened to the entire account without interrupting, and at the end said only, "Noted." It was not much. It was, Arya understood by then, a very great deal coming from that particular elder, and it was followed 3 days later by a formal amendment to the transit clause, closing the gap Sunward Extraction had found, co-authored at the elder's own request, by Arya's office and the Assembly's legal staff jointly. It was the first piece of Assembly statute humanity had ever helped write. No one made a ceremony of it. Arya kept a printed copy of the amendment in her quarters anyway, in the same box where she kept Priya's message, because she had learned, by then, which small things were actually worth keeping. There was the year the Joint Council's ratification nearly collapsed entirely over a dispute about representation quotas, resolved only after 11 straight days of negotiation that Arya followed from the Grand Ring with the specific, helpless frustration of someone watching a fire she couldn't put out from several light years away. There was the year a graduate student named Priya, 19 by then, having spent 2 years methodically working her way into an official youth exchange placement after Arya personally intervened, the first time, to keep a headstrong 12-year-old stowaway from getting permanently barred from assembly space. stood up during an open session Q&A and asked a Sorrel delegate a question about long-term species memory that the delegate later described, through Karskittenvar, as the first question in 40 years that required him to actually think before answering. And there was the quiet, steady accumulation of smaller things that Arya, looking back, would come to think mattered more than any single dramatic incident. A shared meal protocol worked out between human and Eladine observers after 18 months of trial and error. A piece of human music, played in the Grand Ring's public atrium by a violinist who talked her way into a performance slot that drew a small curious crowd of 9 different species and left at least one young Nixtar. Enforcement trainee standing at the back for the entire set with an expression Karskittenvar later confirmed was, for their species, something close to wonder. A running joke, half a decade old by the time it stopped being a joke, about whether the Eladine Records Office would ever admit they'd started keeping a folder specifically for Sol 3 procedural irregularities, which by year 8 had grown thick enough that Vethric Somadair, promoted by then to senior archivist largely on the strength of having correctly identified the original petition as legitimate 9 years earlier, kept it on permanent display in their office as what they called dryly, a monument to what happens when the statute actually gets read. Chapter 13. The boy who learned the language. Theo Kessler Adeyemi was 14 the day the Halcyon Drift's discovery broke on every news channel on Earth, and Arya's clearest memory of that first week was not the emergency UN session, or the frantic calls from journalists, or even the buoy's dry, damning compliance notes. It was Theo, sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning, 3 days after the story broke, with a leaked partial glossary of Assembly Standard Phonetics open on his tablet, sounding out syllables under his breath with the fierce, private concentration of a boy who had decided, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, that this was going to matter to his entire life and intended to be ready for it. You should sleep, Arya had told him that first night, not yet understanding what she was looking at. You should too, Theo had said without looking up. But you're not going to, so I don't see why I should either. She hadn't had an answer for that. She still didn't 10 years later, except that it had turned out to be more or less true for both of them, for most of the decade that followed. He was not, in those early years, an obvious choice for anything. He was quiet in rooms full of adults, which people sometimes mistook for shyness and which was, Arya came to understand, something closer to the opposite, a boy who preferred to listen fully before he spoke at all, and who had, by 16, absorbed more of the fragmentary assembly standard grammar than most of the professional linguists the UN working group had hired to study it. He wrote to Arya constantly during the 10-year provisional term, first as a nephew asking questions, then gradually as something closer to a junior colleague whose questions had started to require actual research to answer. By 19, he had talked his way into an unpaid research placement with the Joint Council's fledgling diplomatic office, on the strength of a self-translated annotation of a fragment of assembly procedural law that the office's actual hired translator had gotten subtly wrong in 3 places. By 22, the placement was paid, and Arya had stopped being the one who explained things to him and started, more and more often, being the one he explained things to. She remembered clearly the first time she watched him hold his own in a room that mattered. He was 24, standing in for Arya at a routine procedural session because she'd been pulled into the Sunward extraction crisis on short notice, and a Turnus junior delegate, testing him the way junior delegates sometimes tested junior humans, to see what the new species bench strength actually looked like beneath its one visible representative, had raised a deliberately obscure point of transit statute, phrased in a dense, old-fashioned register that even some native assembly standard speakers found difficult. Theo had answered it correctly, cited the relevant amendment, and then, in the detail Arya heard about secondhand from 3 separate delegates who'd been in the room, all of whom seemed to find it more remarkable than he did, had gently, politely, and entirely without malice pointed out that the delegate's own citation of the counterstatute was a cycle out of date, superseded by a revision the Tyrannus government itself had ratified 2 years earlier. The delegate had not tested him again. You didn't have to correct her, Arya said, when she finally heard the full story. She would have found out eventually, Theo said, with a shrug that had, by then, very little of the anxious 14-year-old left in it. I'd rather she found out from someone being polite about it than someone being smug about it later. It matters which one she remembers. Arya had looked at him for a long moment and thought, not for the first time, that whatever this whole decade turned out to cost her personally, it had produced at least one thing she would never regret. A nephew who had grown, almost entirely on his own initiative, into exactly the kind of person this seat actually needed. Not because she had built him into it, but because he had built himself methodically out of a 14-year-old's stubborn refusal to go to sleep before she did. Chapter 14. The final vote came at the end of the 10th year in the Grand Ring's full chamber before all 94 seated delegates, broadcast on every relay channel the Assembly maintained and, through a bandwidth-sharing arrangement the Joint Council had spent 2 years negotiating, on every major news network on Earth as well. Arya sat in the gallery, not the floor, because provisional observers did not sit on the floor during a ratification vote. That was, after everything, still the rule, and she had long since stopped minding rules that had a clear and honest reason behind them. Beside her sat Theo, 27 now, who had spent the intervening decade doing exactly what he'd told her he was going to do the very first week of this whole impossible undertaking. Learning everything he could, methodically, patiently, until the Joint Council's diplomatic corps had no honest reason left not to bring him on as a junior attaché, and then, 3 years later, as Arya's own deputy. 90 trillion kilometers away, it was, depending on time zone, either the middle of the night or the middle of a workday that had, for practical purposes, stopped happening. Schools in 6 countries had suspended lessons to broadcast the relay feed on classroom screens. Priya, 22 now and midway through a graduate program in interstellar policy she had built her entire academic career toward since the age of 12, watched the feed from a lecture hall packed with 300 people who had crowded in to watch alongside her, because word had spread that the girl who'd once stowed away to see the grand ring in person was in the room, and people wanted, in whatever small and slightly irrational way, to be near that particular thread of the story when the result came in. Dev Okonkworeas watched it from the Halcyon Drift's cramped common room, docked for routine maintenance at the very same orbital platform where she'd first cracked the buoy's encryption a decade earlier, surrounded by a crew that had, over 10 years, become something between colleagues and family, all of them silent, all of them watching the same small screen that had once shown nothing but debris field telemetry. Arya had sat through enough assembly votes by then to know the particular quality of the silence that fell over a chamber in the last 30 seconds before a result posted. How the air seemed to hold itself differently, how even species with no facial expression Arya could reliably read still managed to communicate the specific tension of waiting through nothing but posture and stillness. The result appeared on the central display. 61 in favor. 33 against. Full ratification approved. Theo made a sound beside her that wasn't quite a word. Somewhere below, on the chamber floor, Karskittenvar, no longer merely her escort by this point, but something closer to a friend, in whatever specific way that word applied across 94 species worth of different definitions, turned and looked up toward the gallery, and inclined their head, once, in a gesture Arya had learned over 10 years, meant something like respect freely given rather than procedurally required. Seat 95 would be refitted. It took 6 weeks, new materials, correct proportions, armrests set to human dimensions, the backrest angled for a human spine instead of the Dravani standard frame. It had been built to 11,000 years before anyone imagined it might one day need to hold a person from Sol 3 at all. Chapter 15. What stays? Arya did not take the seat herself. She had known, for longer than she'd admitted even to herself that she wasn't going to, had known it, if she was honest, somewhere around year 6, watching Theo stand in front of a room of delegates 3 times his age and hold his ground on a technical point of assembly procedure without once looking to her for help. She nominated him formally in the 9th month after ratification. The Joint Council confirmed him unanimously, which surprised no one who had watched the last decade unfold, and on the day of his formal seating, Arya stood at the back of the chamber's public gallery, not the floor, this time by choice rather than rule, and watched a 28-year-old man she had once caught reading a leaked assembly standard glossary at 2 in the morning sit down in a seat that had been empty for 400 years before anyone alive had known it existed, and fit into it like it had been waiting for exactly him the whole time. The reception afterward filled the atrium past capacity, the same atrium where Kamar Belhaj had once played to a handful of curious strangers, now permanently hung with a small, unofficial plaque some junior Eladine archivist had installed without asking anyone's permission, reading simply Statute 12, Section 4, correctly applied. Kamar played again that night, joined this time by 3 other human musicians who had made the transit specifically for the occasion, and by a sorrel string ensemble that had spent the better part of a year, in secret, learning to adapt human musical notation to their own instruments as a gift for the ceremony, unveiled without warning partway through the evening to a silence that broke, a few bars in, into something Arya had never heard a room full of 94 species do in unison before, and would never entirely find the right word for afterward. Dev Okonkworeas found Arya near the buffet table, considerably grayer than the last time they'd stood in a room together, holding a plate of food from at least 4 different planetary cuisines with the cheerful, indiscriminate enthusiasm of a woman who had spent a career eating freighter rations and had no intention of being picky now. "You know," Dev said, "when I called my captain about that buoy, I told her it was probably nothing." "You told me it might be a weapon," Arya said. "That was Priyesh. I said it was probably the most interesting thing anyone in the system had found in 51 years. Dev looked around the crowded atrium, at Theo standing near the center of a small knot of delegates, visibly at ease in a way that still occasionally startled Arya to see. "I was right about that part, at least." Vethrik Somadair found her not long after, considerably more senior now, trailing 2 junior archivists Arya understood to be personally supervising the ongoing, still growing Sol 3 procedural irregularities file, which had, by unofficial estimate, become one of the most frequently referenced case studies in the Assembly's own internal training materials, held up, Vethric reported with what might, for an Eladine, have qualified as pride, as the definitive example of what happened when a statute was actually read all the way through instead of merely filed. I forwarded a petition once, Vethric said, outside normal procedure. I was quite certain, at the time, that it was a minor irregularity that would resolve itself within the week. How does it feel to have been wrong? Arya asked. Statistically satisfying, Vethric said, in the dry register Arya had come, over a decade, to recognize as the closest thing to a joke the species ever permitted itself in public, and left to go find Karsk Ittenvar, who was, by all reports, still refusing to formally admit involvement in a single one of the procedural irregularities that had made the last 10 years possible. Karsk found Arya at the viewport an hour later. Looking out at the dead star, the Grand Ring had orbited for 11,000 years, giving off no light of its own while the station around it blazed with its own. You made my assignment considerably more complicated than it was meant to be, Karsk said, settling beside her with the particular deliberate stillness that Arya had come, over a decade, to recognize as something close to affection. I know, Arya said. You are aware the original assignment was meant to last 4 days. I am now aware of that, yes. Karsk was quiet for a while. Behind them, the atrium was full, human and Eladine and Sorrel and Nixtar and Tyrannus and a dozen other species Arya had spent 10 years learning to greet correctly. All of them moving through the same space with the unhurried, unremarkable ease of people who had simply gotten used to each other, which was, Arya had come to believe, very nearly the whole point of any of this. The statute, Karsk said eventually. You read the entire thing, before you ever set foot on that way station. I did, Arya said. Twice. I know, Karsk said. I have read the transit logs. The Halcyon Drift's chief engineer arranged your passage under a cargo classification that should not, by any reasonable reading of freight regulation, have applied to a living person. Arya looked at her old friend for a long moment. Are you telling me you knew about that? I am telling you, Karsk said, with the enforcement officer's version of something that might, in a human, have been the beginning of a smile, that a great many procedural irregularities occurred over the last 10 years, and that I have found, on reflection, I am not deeply interested in investigating any of them. Somewhere behind them, someone had started playing music again. Not a violin this time, something with strings and a rhythm Arya didn't recognize, from a species she'd need a moment to place, filling the atrium with sound that belonged to no single world and, in that particular room on that particular day, belonged a little to all of them. Arya listened, and watched the dead star give off no light of its own, and thought about a buoy that had drifted for 400 years carrying a door nobody knew was open, and a niece in spirit 12 years old who had once stowed away across 40 light-years because she refused to believe a closed door was the end of the story, and a nephew, 28 now, sitting in a seat that had waited 11,000 years for someone to finally walk through it. She had not wanted power. She had wanted, at the very beginning of all of this, only to make sure a door that had been open the entire time, silently, uselessly, for 400 years, did not close again before anyone on Earth even knew it was there. She had done that. Everything after was simply what people did. Once a door stayed open long enough, they walked through it and they kept walking, long after the person who'd first found the handle had stepped quietly out of the way. That, she thought, watching the light the dead star didn't give and the station gave instead, was enough. It was, in fact, everything. ND Epilogue. 1 year later, a year after the ratification, the Eladine Records Office quietly closed the Sol 3 case file. Not because the story was over, but because, for the first time in 411 years, it no longer needed a special file of its own. Sol 3 had become simply one more entry in the ordinary, ongoing record of the Continuum Assembly's 95th member species, filed alongside routine trade disputes and border adjustments and the 1,000 small, unremarkable administrative motions that made up the actual daily business of governing 81 worlds. Vethric Somadair, by then head archivist, insisted on personally overseeing the closure and insisted, over the mild objection of a superior who thought it excessive, on preserving the original derelict buoy itself, recovered, refurbished, and quietly transported to the Grand Ring at Arya's request, in a small display case near the atrium entrance, with a plaque that gave no editorializing account of what it had done, only a case number, a date, and a single translated line taken directly from Statute 12. Notification is the responsibility of the Outreach Office. People stopped in front of it sometimes, delegates and visitors alike, usually without knowing at first what they were looking at. A plain, unremarkable black box, dented from 400 years adrift, that had once carried, entirely by accident, the only copy of a door nobody had ever meant to leave unlocked. Priya finished her graduate program 2 years later and joined the Joint Council's Diplomatic Corps as its youngest fully credentialed officer, working by her own request directly under Theo, who by then had spent enough years in seat 95 that most of the chamber had simply stopped thinking of him as new. Deva Concorrez retired from the Halcyon Drift eventually, reluctantly, and took a position, over her own repeated insistence that she was just an engineer, not a diplomat, advising the Joint Council's technical office on salvage-derived assembly contact protocols, on the grounds, as Arya put it when she talked her into it, that someone who'd found the door the first time ought to have a say in how the next one got found. Karsk Ittenvar never did formally retire from enforcement duty, and never did formally admit to a single one of the procedural irregularities that had made the entire decade possible, though the running joke about the growing Sol 3 procedural irregularities file eventually acquired a second, unofficial volume that several junior Nixtar officers privately referred to as Karsk's. Arya herself stepped back from formal diplomatic work within 2 years of the ratification, though she never entirely left the Grand Ring behind. She kept a small office near the archive wing, technically attached to nothing, unofficially consulted by nearly everyone, and spent her time doing the thing she had, in the end, always been best at. Reading things carefully that other people hadn't gotten around to reading yet, in case one of them turned out to matter. She still ate the nothing-flavored crackers. On the rare occasions she found herself back in a waystation waiting room. She had, somewhere along the way, genuinely come to like them, or perhaps simply come to associate them so completely with the particular, specific feeling of waiting for a door to open that she couldn't have separated the two anymore even if she'd wanted to, and she had long since stopped wanting to. Seat 95, 12 years after a distracted engineer on a 40-year-old salvage tug pulled a piece of dead mail out of the dark, had never once, in all that time, gone empty again.